My first wish is to see this plague of mankind, war, banished from the earth. The words of George Washington, leader of the revolutionary forces in the American War of Independence, and later, of course, first President of the United States. As horrible as war is, and even though Washington and other great leaders detested it, they also recognized that, in their times, war could be the only way to bring about change. And in the midst of the destruction and carnage, there could be courage and nobility which rose above the fray. In this series, we pay tribute to warriors whose noble qualities speak to us down the centuries. Whether fighting the good fight or defending a lost cause, they followed the warrior's way. Fraser Dundyche, born in 1287, is the scion of one of the oldest Highland clans in Scotland. A young man with heroes to admire and a reputation to live up to. For Fraser and all Scottish clansmen, the warrior's way is a lifetime commitment.
The Highland warriors are one element of a larger Scottish military representation. Highland warriors, I suppose, are men who are raised in war, they're trained from quite an early age in war. They live within quite a militaristic society, a society that oftentimes farms at one point in the year and fights in another part of the year. Sometimes that's local, within Scotland there's inter-clan disputes. But at other times, they hire themselves out as mercenary warriors.
Scottish clansmen seem to be all our ancestors, don't they? Every single one of us has a bit of Scotland in us.
The year before Fraser's birth, in 1286, it had been decreed that all Scottish freemen were obliged to do 40 days a year of what we'd call today national service. This obligation took in most social classes, including barons and thanes, the Scottish clan chieftains.
So the king could call upon his tenants-in-chief to provide a number of soldiers per year. Now the common army could be called nationally, it could be called across the Highlands and the Lowlands. Sometimes it's called in a quite specific area within Scotland to solve an issue. So the common army could be about defending the kingdom on behalf of the king, or it could be about keeping the peace within the kingdom itself.
The Army of Scotland is representative of the kingdom as a whole, but it's a select group, it's a chosen number of men.
The Scottish warrior going to war for his independence, fighting like a proverbial warrior poet, whatever the odds against him. Through the mists of time, we glimpse his wild eyes and fiery red hair. And to the skirl of the bagpipes, we can hear his battle cry. Fighting his tyrannical oppressors, the scheming and conniving English kings and their court, outnumbered but never bested when it comes to courage, waving his two-handed sword as he charges into battle. It's an irresistible image. But is there a foundation of truth behind it?
There is an element of reality in as much as the depiction of these men as warriors, as men who are, as I said, who are used to fighting, who have experience of fighting, who have been brought up where warfare is part and parcel of what they do. It's not all they do. But it is, a decent part of what they do, and they are prepared and ready to fight when called upon.
Fraser Dundyke's story is centered around the Scottish Wars of Independence in the late 13th, early 14th centuries. Their enemy was, of course, the English, who wished to impose not only their king, Edward I, but also their feudal system upon the people of Scotland. The English would find that their northern neighbors prized their freedom and would fight to the last man to preserve it, just as the Romans had discovered before them.
If you ever have a chance, one of the most amazing things on earth to see is Hadrian's Wall. In its existence today, 2,000 years from when it was built, it still is this impressive structure that cut off all of Scotland, 70 miles long. All of Scotland. People walk it all the day, every day. You can go see the fortresses and how big and strong it was. Why did they build the wall? There were people who wanted what they had, meaning the Romans. The Romans were fearsome warriors. The Picts were good raiders, as all Scots were good raiders all the way throughout history. They would cross over a border very quickly, steal everything, and run back.
The Roman sources do talk about the Picts as being a difficult opponent. And in some ways, they're doing some of the guerrilla tactics we are so famously associating with the Wars of Independence or any of these border skirmishes with the English. And they are good at using the terrain. They come out of the mist, so they have this almost mythologized spookiness about them, because they will come under cover of fog and attack when people are vulnerable. And they are not going to take prisoners.
The Romans come north, but they don't ever stay too long. And so once the Romans are away again, the Picts are able to then raid south into Roman Britain. And so you have something like, Hadrian's Wall being established in part as a defensive measure to try and keep the Picts and others out. But apparently the Picts are also quite well catered for in terms of naval resources. So ironically, they're able to bypass the wall and attack northeastern England by sea.
Hadrian's Wall certainly did not stop the Picts from raiding Roman settlements. Indeed, at one point in the 2nd century, the Picts took complete control of the entire 70-mile-plus wall. Later, even the Vikings approached Scotland with a degree of caution. However, Vikings did eventually settle in Scotland, mixing their own fierce warrior blood with that of the Picts. By the time Fraser Dundyke is born, the Scots' reputation for ferocity is well established.
So, for example, we have a 12th century chronicler, Aelred of Rievaulx, and he's a Cistercian abbot. He's writing from Rievaulx Abbey in Yorkshire. And he records these amazing battles between the English and the Scots, and he describes the Scottish behaviour. And he uses all of the tropes, the normal words that we would associate with the Scottish warrior. Savage, barbaric, brutal, unrelenting, all of those things are in his sources. He goes a step further. He particularly singles out the Galwegians, so the men of Galloway, and this is a really interesting choice. He calls them baby killers. He said and some of his fellow chroniclers, they make these descriptions of the men of Galloway not nice, crushing babies beneath the hooves of their horses' feet, ripping fetuses out from pregnant women's stomachs, and dashing the fetus on stones, murdering, raping, setting fires.
Like later Hollywood producers, medieval scribes did not always let the facts stand in the way of a good, blood-curdling story. But there's no doubt that medieval Scots were fearsome warriors. Their reputation was well-founded. However, before the Wars of Independence, most of their fighting involved one Scots clan pitted against another. It was known as the Gathering. Chieftains and clansmen of the great clans came together in one place. Bagpipes sounded, the Highland Fling was danced, and Highland games were played with gusto. Contests, such as the tossing of the caber, where competitors see who can throw a 20-foot pole the furthest distance, and hammer throwing. All good, clean fun. But don't be mistaken. Clan membership was a matter of blood, soil, and warrior pride. Even today, for many Scots, clan membership is serious business. For Fraser Dundyke, at large during the turn of the 12th and 13th century, clan membership was everything. Born into one of Scotland's first major clans, his loyalty to clan comes before loyalty to country, and certainly before any crown. It all sounds very team-spirited, but Scottish clans spent much of their time fighting one another. They lived off the land and the cattle that grazed upon it, so most of their disputes were over territory and livestock. These disputes could be bitter and bloody. Some of the better-known grudge matches went on for centuries.
Two of these were the Campbells and MacDonalds. We don't understand why. We really don't have any records. There's a lot of different mythical ideas that one cow was stolen here, or one person was raped here, or one person was killed here. Pretty much like any feud. It starts, and then it continues on because nobody will stop it. This one continued on for centuries.
It's an excellent example, one of the longest lasting ones. And in fact, they still have a saying, never trust a Campbell, because of how the Campbell-MacDonald rivalry ended.
Somebody like James VI is trying to solve what he calls his Highland problem. And so you get into the 18th century, you have the massacre at Glencoe, which is one of the more infamous ones, where the MacDonalds lets the Campbell agents in and put them up for the night and give them hospitality, and then the Campbells murdered them in their beds.
This was the bitter end of a clan feud that had begun in the 13th century and lasted at least 500 years.
It's a bit of a depressing thing that one of the defining characteristics is not letting a grudge go, but we've got so much evidence of families who make it their business to hate another family for a period of several hundred years. So quite simply, the dispute between the Campbells and MacDonalds is about power and proximity. They are neighbouring clans in the West Coast.
Whether the Scottish clans were fighting each other or battling so-called outlanders or sannochs, what kind of weapons did Scottish clansmen like Fraser carry into battle?
But the Scottish culture, especially the Highland culture, is for valuing speed and tactics over brute force and sheer volume of weapons. We like to have this notion of the Scottish warrior who is armed to the teeth, the knife hidden in the sock, and extra things that could be brought out into battle. And it's certainly the case that most soldiers, most warriors are going to be having more than one weapon.
swords probably, but certainly spears are absolutely a classic part of warfare across the Middle Ages, and the West Highlands and the Highlands are no different. But also things like axes, very much the West Highlands in particular are quite known for the axe, sometimes with a long shaft, so it's not a hand axe, it's a two-handed, almost like a spear, but with an axe head on the end. The Lochaber axe is probably one of those types of things, and so with a longer reach and ability to do more damage.
Fraser spends a lot of time learning how to use this array of weapons as a matter of survival, but also a matter of pride. It's not difficult to see how a pike could inflict mortal wounds. The Scots carried several variations on the pike. There was the flail, the glaive, and the Highland halberd, also known as the Lochaber axe, essentially an axe on the end of a long pole. These were weapons capable of felling an armored knight from his horse with one blow. Pikes were central to a Scots battle tactic known as the schiltron. Foot soldiers carrying pikes formed a rectangle or oval, their weapons tilted outwards, so as to present a sharp fence to attackers.
So the schiltron is a very exciting piece of technology, and it's a very successful tool in the Scottish arsenal. It requires incredible precision and training. The schiltron needs to be drilled in order to be effective, and it's like the Anglo-Saxon shield wall or the Roman phalanx. It requires on-the-group functioning and not breaking down. So it is very difficult to penetrate at close quarters.
Any Scots warrior who was really armed to the teeth probably had to bring his own weapons. Case in point, in the year 1318, Robert the Bruce decreed that any man who owned goods equivalent to the value of a cow should supply their own spear, sword, or bow and arrow with 24 arrows. As for his attire, in the Hollywood history of Scotland, the warriors who fought with William Wallace and Robert the Bruce were all wearing kilts. But is this another case of not letting the truth get in the way of a good story?
The kilt that we recognise and that we see in Braveheart or in any blockbuster is very likely to be quite a modern thing. The common story that's told is that it's the creation of Thomas Rawlinson, an industrialist and inventor in 1720, and he's English. So this would be the skirt-only piece. What we know is that in the Highlands, people are wearing a plaid, that it is a much longer and larger piece of material, and that it's designed to be able to protect people from the elements. And if you think about where they are, bare legs is not necessarily going to be very nice, especially at night. So to have a longer piece of equipment that you can drape round yourself and stay warmer is going to be an advantage.
The equivalent for Highland warriors would have been, the plaid, so you have a massive piece of material that you wrap around yourself. And yes, it probably would have been vaguely kilt-like, but it's not anything like, modern kilts, which are all colour and a standard length and all the rest of it.
The use of different patterns, tartan, to distinguish one's clan was something that came later, in the 17th century. Some Highlanders were not only bare-legged, but also barefoot, even throughout the freezing cold of the Scottish winter. The reputation for toughness of these feral fighting men was clearly well-deserved. The Scots would need all the toughness they could muster in the half-century of wars between 1296 and 1346. The accidental deaths of King Alexander III and his supposed successor, Margaret, Maid of Norway, had left Scotland without a monarch. But plenty who claimed the throne was theirs by right. The Scots looked south to England for help, asking King Edward I to intervene. In retrospect, this was a terrible misjudgment, because Edward intervened all right. He placed a puppet ruler on the Scottish throne and began to rule by proxy, demanding higher taxes and troops for his war against France. There was only one thing for it: war. But in taking on the English, the Scots would be facing off against what was probably Europe's most formidable fighting force. How could a ragtag army of sheep stealers be expected to beat the armored knights of England?
The Wars of Independence are absolutely a very fascinating thing because there is this sense of a purity of a cause. It's fighting for independence, fighting for freedom is universal. It's something we can all relate to.
At the beginning of the wars, I don't think things looked great for the Scots. England is a much bigger country. It is a much wealthier kingdom. And as a result of that wealth and a result of that landed wealth, it's able to produce a lot more soldiers. It's able to produce a lot more knights. So you have far more men who are well armoured, who are mounted. You know, England can summon a couple of thousand knights, whereas Scotland can summon a couple of hundred if it's lucky. England can call upon resources from different territories that are part of the wider English realm. So England is able to call on troops from Ireland, from Wales, who come with their own specialisms. And so the English military machine is quite an advanced thing. It is a powerful thing, and the English can raise huge armies.
Every good story about freedom fighters requires a villain, and the English invariably managed to supply one. King Edward I had two nicknames in his life: Longshanks, because he stood at around 6'2", very tall indeed for that time. And the second one was the Hammer of the Scots. It was on his orders that the Scottish border town of Berwick was sacked and its people brutalized. The massacre of Berwick, as it came to be known, was described thus in Bowers' Chronicle. Edward spared no one, whatever the age or sex, and for 2 days streams of blood flowed from the bodies of the slain. For in his tyrannous rage, he ordered 7,500 souls of both sexes to be massacred. Hard to believe this quaint border town was once the site of so much bloodshed, but it was. If ever there was a time for heroes, this was it. Step forward, William Wallace, Robert the Bruce, and in his own modest way, our own Fraser Donadike. In the 19th century, this impressive monument to William Wallace was built atop the rock of Abbey Craig near Stirling. The Scots and English had long since made peace, and all could admire the bravery of this most impressive warrior. Like Edward I, Wallace was a big man, around 6'4" in his case, and a hard man by any standards.
William Wallace was a thug. He was a rebel, he was a thief, he was probably a madman. His rebellion gets going primarily because he's successful at unifying certain other madmen, certain other thieves, certain other thugs go against the English, and because they have this great victory at Stirling Bridge.
With his lightning raids on the English, William Wallace did much to restore his people's pride and the dream of an independent Scotland. Around a year after the massacre at Berwick in 1297, William Wallace had gone a long way to driving English forces from Scottish lands. In retaliation, the English sent a large army north with the express intention of teaching the Scots a lesson. But it was they who would be schooled. William Wallace and his allies knew they were outnumbered, but if they could choose the terrain, they might have a chance against the English. And here it is, Stirling Bridge, the only place for miles where an invading army could bring its supply wagons. If the Scots attacked here, the English would be left with two not very good options: either to stand and fight at the crossing or withdraw, leaving northern Scotland to the Highlanders.
So the Battle of Stirling Bridge is an excellent example of where the Scots can really excel, because they size up the geography, they make a stand at a very strategic point, and they wait. They don't go and rush to meet the English. They wait around the corner behind a hill, and they are poised and ready to flood down as quickly as possible and massacre them. The Stirling Bridge was so narrow that only 2 people on horseback could travel at the same time. And the English army was enormous. It would have taken them hours to cross the bridge.
It's only partially a battle, I suppose. It's an ambush. The Scots secrete their army in a wood, in a forest, largely, so that they're hidden mostly from view, and they let the English army start to cross this bridge at Stirling. And then when the English army is partway across, the Scots descend on the English army and attack them while only half of them have crossed the river. And so the English are then, there's only half of their force to fight the Scots. They have the river at their backs, and they are defeated in relatively short order.
Stirling Bridge was a resounding victory for William Wallace and the Scot rebels. The tide had turned in their favor, or so it seemed.
In the wake of Stirling Bridge, the Scots go and raid into England, threatening even somewhere like York. They descend quite far into England. And so that very much takes the war to England again, just when the English have thought that the war is over, effectively. Of course, the English will come back, but for that kind of short period of time, the Scots seem to have the upper hand.
King Edward was not going to tolerate this rebellion for long. Less than a year later, in July 1298, the English would have their revenge on Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk. And this time, it was they who made use of a tactical advantage: the longbow.
Scots get lured onto marshy ground in Falkirk, rather stupid maneuver by William Wallace, where Edward is able to lure his major portion of the troops into ground that they couldn't move across very effectively, and then Edward stood back with his longbowmen, and they launched arrow upon arrow upon arrow onto him, and they were poorly armored and thus completely defeated rather quickly.
This is a very different battle from Stirling Bridge. This isn't an ambush, this is a proper set piece. And the Scottish army at Falkirk, Wallace decides to put the Scots into a series of divisions called schiltrums. And so you have your infantry in a large body, all armed with spears, and those spears are then pointed out the way. So it forms something like a hedgehog, so that the English cavalry, if it attacks those standing groups, can't break through. And indeed, the horses and the knights will hit the spears before they ever get to the soldiers. And this is what happened. The English charge time and again against the Scottish divisions, but without any effect, and the Scots are holding firm, and it looks like it might be going the Scottish way. But at that point, Edward I makes the decision to withdraw the cavalry and bring forward his archers. And the archers then proceed to pour missile fire into the Scottish divisions. And the Scottish infantry are not well enough protected to withstand that sort of attack.
Once the English longbowmen created gaps in the Scottish defenses, their cavalry swept in, and the Scots turned and ran for their lives. William Wallace would remain on the run for nearly 8 years before he was betrayed, captured, and taken to London to be tried for treason in 1305. He was sentenced to death, but the execution was barbaric, even by the standards of the day. After being dragged naked through the streets by a horse, Wallace was hung. Then, while still alive, he was eviscerated, castrated, and finally beheaded, drawn, and quartered. His head and body parts put on display to discourage anyone else with similar ideas of rebellion. But for the Scots, being the contrarians they are, it had the opposite effect. Fraser Donadike was born just a little too late to fight for William Wallace. But he surely would have if he could have. But as the horror of Wallace's trial and execution sunk in, another Scottish clansman was stepping up to take his place, Robert the Bruce, Scotland's most famous warrior king. To fight for Robert the Bruce in the cause of freedom becomes Fraser Donadice's greatest ambition. And soon, he will get his wish.
Robert the Bruce is held in even higher esteem than William Wallace because he had a successful, decisive end point and because he became king. So he gets all the credit for ending civil war, for restoring business as usual in Scotland, and for ending this English incursion into Scottish affairs.
Robert the Bruce was as ambitious as he was brave, ruthless as he was resolute. In some respects, Bruce was like a Macbeth who got away with it. Exhibit A, he killed his main rival for the Scottish crown, John the Red Comyn. Not on the field of battle, but in a church. The Franciscan church at Dumfries, to be precise.
So what we do know is when Robert Bruce is meeting John Comyn, they're meeting to make an alliance, to have peace. Everything looks pretty good, and then suddenly Robert Bruce pulls his dagger and sticks it right between Comyn's ribs and kills him. And he walks out and says, "Yeah, well, peace has been made. Alliance has been made."
After murdering John Comyn in February 1306, Robert the Bruce was hastily crowned king. But a series of defeats by both rival clans and the English forced him into hiding. Now he was a king only in name. Things were so desperate that the Bruce hid in a cave where, legend has it, he observed a spider take 7 attempts to spin a web. 7. Robert the Bruce concluded it would take that kind of persistence to win the Scottish crown. So we took up where William Wallace had left off. Today, we would call it guerrilla warfare. In their battle for independence against their hated English overlords, the Scottish clans are determined to follow the example set by their fallen hero, William Wallace, and pursue guerrilla tactics to demoralize and deplete their enemy before confronting them on the battlefield.
Certainly to the English opponents in the medieval period, guerrilla warfare tactics were not playing by the rules. So they're not chivalric, they're not meeting at a battlefield out in the open, but they are relying on their strengths. And to a lot of English chroniclers in particular, this isn't on. And it allows them to build up this portrayal of the savage, barbaric, uncivilized Scot because there is such a contrast in behaviour in battle. It is unfortunate, but that's how it has been portrayed in all of the sources. So guerrilla warfare, it's very much in view in some of these key wars of independence successes. It's about intimate knowledge of the terrain, and you would not expect an English army or even English scouts to be able to identify a place of battle. So this is something about being in the land and being of the land and knowing where to go.
Robert Bruce plays for the English for a while, and he realizes that they're rather weak when Edward II comes on the throne after his father's death in 1307. So Edward II has great failings, and he knows he's not like Edward I was. So Robert Bruce rebels. He's not particularly successful at the beginning, but he catches the same spirit, and he catches some of the same men who had fought with William Wallace, and they start unifying and coming around him.
Confronting the English army in the open field was at first out of the question, so Bruce staged a series of surprise attacks on castles held by the English. And it is during one such attack that we'll see Fraser prove his mettle. With his small band of warriors, Fraser waits until nightfall, and then they scaled the fortress walls with grappling hooks and rope ladders. A few men can now sneak inside and open the gates to larger bodies of bloodthirsty Scots who rush in and literally catch the English while they are sleeping. These kind of attacks not only returned castles to the Scots, but also deprived the English of key bases and supplies. The American General Patton once famously advised would-be leaders to, quote, "do everything you ask of those you command." And in the winter of 1313 at Perth Castle, Robert the Bruce showed his personal courage by wading across an ice-cold moat before climbing up a rope ladder and opening the gates. Fraser, of course, will follow wherever the Bruce leads.
Well, you have the example at Perth where the Scots swam across the moat. Bruce is there with them, swimming across the moat to deploy these special scaling ladders they've had developed so they can chuck the ladders over the wall, climb over the wall when in darkness when the castle garrison doesn't expect it, and to capture it. The Scots disguise themselves as cowherds, bringing the cattle back into a castle in the evening. Then when they're in the gate, they use a cart to prop open the portcullis and to stop them shutting that so they can get in.
Another classic clan warrior tactic was to raid English troops while they were on the move, cutting off groups of soldiers before laying waste to them. The Scots lived off the land, meaning they had no baggage train, whereas the English supply lines were vulnerable to attack.
The Scots, particularly Highlanders, are used to travelling lots of distance and surmounting very difficult terrain, so it's normal for them. They use ponies rather than horses because ponies can cope with this terrain better too. So they are used to being on horseback from a young age. So this allows them as adults to be able to do this for considerable lengths of time and to cover significant distances. And it's this ability and this willingness to travel and to travel quickly that is key in their success.
Although keenly aware that he was outnumbered by the battle-hardened and professional English army, the Bruce had to face his enemy on the open field at some point. Whenever possible, he would choose the terrain, preferably with a river or marshland between them and a forest behind him, the ideal spot to await the English attack. Robert the Bruce's first major victory in pitched battle was in May 1307 at Loudon Hill. The site for the battle had been prearranged, following a challenge by the English commander. Although Bruce was severely outnumbered, the prior notification of where the battle was to take place gave him and his troops ample time to prepare the ground to their advantage and to suit their tactics.
So the Battle of Loudon Hill is very much marking a change in how Robert the Bruce is commanding his army. He's learned from the catastrophic defeat, the defeat that spawns the Spider legend. He's learned to control the terrain. He's learned that he cannot best the English army even with his superior numbers. So he needs to be very careful about how he marks out a battlefield and how his Scottish troops approach the English troops. So that means waiting until the right moment, ideally controlling the higher ground, restricting how many English can advance at one time, and then moving very quickly and striking to eliminate as many English soldiers as possible. So we really see him identifying his style of military leadership, and it is very successful.
Most of the English had been on horseback at Loudon Hill, so those not trapped in the specially prepared ditches fled the scene of battle from the bloodthirsty Scots, who were principally on foot. At Loudon Hill, Bruce's forces had won a stunning victory against massive odds. This would give them the confidence to finally strike at the heart of the English military machine. The English and Scots would meet again in open battle around a year later. But it was apparent that the English had not learned their lesson. On the 23rd and 24th of June 1308, at a place called Bannockburn, over 2 days of bitter combat, the English cavalry repeatedly tried to break the Scottish defenses, but to no avail. Bannockburn was also said to be the beginning of a new type of warfare in medieval Europe, where infantry and not cavalry dominated the battlefield.
Bruce at Falkirk kept his children stationary, roped together, penned in so that they can't go anywhere. Bruce had his troops being mobile, and his children moved forward and took the attack to the English. But with that same hedgehog-like idea, the English can't break the Scottish schiltrums down. The English cavalry is caught with the schiltrums in front of it and its own infantry behind it. It can't bring the infantry up, fight against the Scots hand to hand, because the cavalry's in the way. And when the English try and use archers like Egbert I did at Falkirk, the Scots send in their cavalry to chase the archers from the battlefield, and so the English missile threat is nullified. And as the Scots continue to push the English back, the English cavalry then starts to fall on its own infantry. And the infantry then panics and runs. But at the English rear is the Bannockburn itself, and probably more English drown in the burn than perhaps are necessarily killed on the field itself.
"15 years after Bannockburn, Robert the Bruce, Scotland's greatest warrior king, died of natural causes. And then, just as he had wished, his heart was carried into battle to inspire the Scots onto acts of bravery. This, rather than Wallace, was the beginning of the Braveheart legend. Scotland would go back and forth between independence and English rule in the centuries to come. In the 18th century, the Jacobites, as they were known, had their eye not only on Scotland, but the British throne itself, with a series of rebellions in Scotland in 1715, 1719, and 1745. They sought to overthrow the ruling Hanoverian royal family and replace them with the Scottish House of Stuart. Like their medieval clan forebears, the Scots rebels of the 18th century would supply history with their own share of heroes, tragedy, and romance. The stuff that myths are made of, which is why, hundreds of years later, many people have heard of Charles Edward Stuart, the Young Pretender, also known as Bonnie Prince Charlie. After some initial successes, Charles Stuart's army of Jacobite rebels faced the English at the Battle of Culloden in 1745. This was to be the last ever pitched battle fought on the British Isles. Though pounded by artillery, the outnumbered Jacobites retaliated with the kind of Highland sword charge that you'd expect from a nation of warrior poets. But this time, the English line held firm. The Jacobite army was routed, and the Bonnie Prince escaped to the continent. After the battle, wounded Highlanders were bayoneted where they lay, and any fleeing soldiers hunted down and murdered. A period of brutal repression followed in the Highlands. The wearing of the kilt and playing of the bagpipes was banned. The English tried to break up the old clan system entirely, but though they might suppress their traditions, they would never break the Scots' warrior spirit.
A lot of people have a very decent idea in their own minds what the medieval Scottish warrior was and what he did. But also then, as I said, that development of Scottish warriors throughout the later medieval period and the early modern period, where the Scots start to export themselves physically as mercenary warriors, as soldiers who could be hired, who can be used, who can be counted upon to fight when others may have run away. You know, they will fight no matter the conditions, as long as they're paid, as long as they're fed, they will do as they're told. And they develop a reputation for being dependable, for being solid, for being brave and resolute, and being able to fight wherever they're required. And they develop that throughout the early modern period, fighting in various parts of continental Europe, fighting for the Swedes, fighting for the Holy Roman Empire, fighting for the Russians. No matter who it is, the Scots seem to do a pretty good job.
Over time, the Scots developed a reputation as being ferocious combatants. It was an image that had substance, but the Scots also knew how to play up to that image.
In the campaign before Waterloo, in 1815, the 79th Cameron Highlanders found some spare breastplates from French soldiers, and they make them into frying pans. So they're cooking some steaks, and they invite some Belgian soldiers to come and share a meal with them. Only the Belgians see the frying meat in the breastplates of French soldiers and run away in horror because they think they're cannibals. They're playing up to this barbaric, ruthless savagery that will help scare people away. But there's some other examples too. In World War I, the German Imperial Army was using an image of a Scottish warrior in some of its propaganda, and it uses the kilt. It uses the classic image that we understand to mean Scottish warrior. They kind of forefront it in their propaganda because they are so scared of them. They were terrified of the Black Watch Regiment. They called the Scots the devils in kilts. They called them the ladies from hell. They were absolutely horrified by the thought of having to fight Scots.
The Scots eventually would win the right to self-determination in most important aspects. They would do so peacefully, however, and through parliamentary means, which is admirable. Though admirably peaceful and democratic, acts of parliament are just not as evocative as the Scottish clansmen of old. Stubborn, rebellious, and brave to the point of foolishness. Fraser Donadike is a fictional character, but he represents many such a man who fought for the Scottish clans. That was the Scottish clansman's tradition. That was the warrior's way.